Once upon a time, Detroit was the symbol of American power, a city that roared, literally. Engines hummed, factories thundered, and a million workers built the machines that moved the world. It was the home of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, the Big Three, and for most of the 20th century, the motor of the American dream. But by 2013, that dream had stalled. Detroit, once one of the richest cities in the nation, became the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. How does a city that helped win World War II collapse under its own weight? This is the story of how America's auto capital went broke, and why it wasn't just bad management. It was a slow-motion implosion decades in the making. The rise of the Motor City. Let's rewind. Early 1900s. Detroit was booming. Henry Ford had just introduced the Model T, the car that would put America on wheels. And his assembly line revolutionized not just cars, but capitalism itself. Factories multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Jobs poured in, and so did people. By 1950, Detroit had 1.85 million residents, the fourth largest city in the U.S. If you wanted a stable job, a good wage, and a house with a yard, you moved to Detroit. Auto workers, with their strong unions, steady pay, and pensions that promised lifelong security, weren't just making cars. They were building the American middle class. It wasn't called the Motor City for nothing. The cracks beneath the chrome. But while the surface gleamed with chrome and optimism, cracks were forming underneath. Detroit's economy revolved almost entirely around the auto industry. It was a one-engine machine, and no one was thinking about what would happen if that engine sputtered. Then came the 1960s and 70s. Foreign automakers, especially from Japan and Germany, entered the U.S. market with smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. Meanwhile, American automakers clung to the formula that had once made them rich, big, gas-hungry vehicles. And when the 1973 oil crisis hit, suddenly those massive Cadillacs and Buicks looked more like dinosaurs than dreams. Japanese brands like Toyota and Honda didn't just compete. They ate Detroit's lunch. Factories slowed. Layoffs began. But Detroit's cracks went beyond economics. The city was trapped in a social contract that was once its greatest strength, the legacy costs. For every active worker at GM, there were multiple retirees relying on lifelong pensions and health care plans. It was a demographic pyramid scheme, and the base was shrinking. The fire inside the city. In 1967, the city exploded, literally. The Detroit riot, one of the deadliest in U.S. history, left 43 dead and thousands of buildings destroyed. It wasn't just about police brutality. It was decades of racial tension, economic inequality, and segregation boiling over. White residents fled to the suburbs almost overnight, a mass exodus known as white flight. Businesses followed. Tax revenue evaporated. And Detroit, once a symbol of integration and opportunity, became a city divided by highways, race, and wealth. By the 1980s, the city that had built cars for the world couldn't even keep its streetlights on. The globalization hit. As the world economy globalized, Detroit found itself outpaced. Factories that once employed tens of thousands began to close or relocate, chasing cheaper labor overseas. Automation added another punch. Machines could do in minutes what human hands took hours to finish. Each new technological leap meant fewer jobs, fewer paychecks, fewer people staying in Detroit. Between 1950 and 2010, Detroit lost over 60% of its population. The Motor City was running on fumes. The politics of decline. City leaders didn't help. Corruption, mismanagement, and denial became Detroit's unofficial policy. Mayors promised revival plans that never arrived. Millions were borrowed to patch budget holes. It was a financial mirage. The facade of a great city was still standing, but inside, the foundations were rotten. And as with any bubble, a moment comes when reality demands payment. The public pension system ballooned. By the 2000s, Detroit owed billions in unfunded pension liabilities. And each year, more of Detroit's budget went to old debts instead of basic city services. The math didn't lie, but for decades, no one wanted to read the numbers out loud. 2008, the final blow. Then came the global financial crisis. The auto industry, Detroit's last pillar, collapsed. General Motors and Chrysler filed for bankruptcy. The U.S. government stepped in with massive bailouts, saving the companies but not the city that birthed them. Detroit's unemployment rate skyrocketed past 25%. Property values cratered. For decades, Detroit had been the city that built America's wealth. Now, it couldn't even afford to pick up its trash. The bankruptcy. By 2013, Detroit had $18 billion in debt, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. The city was drowning in unpaid bills, crumbling infrastructure, and pension obligations it couldn't meet. Streetlights were out across half the city. Emergency response times averaged nearly an hour. It was quite literally a city shutting down. Governor Rick Snyder appointed an emergency manager to take over Detroit's finances, a move that stripped power from elected officials and sparked outrage among residents. But by then, there were no good options left. The bankruptcy wiped out billions in debt and slashed retiree benefits. It was painful, but for the first time in decades, Detroit had a clean slate. The rebuild. Out of the ashes, something surprising began to happen. Young entrepreneurs, artists, and developers saw opportunity in Detroit's ruins. Cheap real estate, abandoned factories, and a certain gritty charm began attracting people back. Downtown slowly revived. Companies like Quicken Loans moved in. The auto industry rebounded, not to its old glory, but into something leaner and smarter, focusing on electric cars and innovation. But the scars remain. Drive a few miles from Detroit's shiny new downtown, and you still see what was lost: miles of empty homes, overgrown lots, forgotten neighborhoods. Detroit's comeback is real, but uneven, and it forces a question: what does a city owe its past when it's trying to build its future? The echo of Detroit. Detroit's story isn't just about cars. It's about what happens when prosperity turns into complacency, when success blinds you to change. It's about how cities can rise on one industry and fall with it, how inequality, segregation, and neglect can rot even the strongest foundation. And maybe most of all, it's about resilience. Because despite everything, the riots, the recession, the bankruptcy, Detroit didn't disappear. It adapted. It evolved. It refused to die. As one mural downtown says, "Out of the ashes we will rise." Today, Detroit stands as both a warning and a promise that even the mightiest empires can fall. And even in ruin, rebirth is possible. We dive into stories like this, where money, power, and people collide. If you want to keep unmasking these myths, like and subscribe.